So I'm going to talk a little bit about PrEP in the media, and I'm mostly referencing it in the US because I think that's where it's made the headlines more so far, but I think it applies to the Canadian context as well. So the position that PrEP has come to occupy in the media is something that fascinates me, because aside from World AIDS Day, when the media turns out some stock articles on the latest plan to end HIV/AIDS, I think it's supposed to end next year, according to some people, or the state of AIDS in Africa, or when it explodes with sensational stories of HIV-positive people facing criminal charges, AIDS has largely fallen off of most people's radar. And I would say that more particularly gay media's radar, which is focused lately on marriage equality. The New York Times has published close to 20 articles on PrEP this year alone, which is an article every other week. And this is of course alongside many, many other publications and a huge social media presence of conversations around PrEP. It's clear that PrEP has become the new face of HIV/AIDS and is being understood as synonymous with the HIV community response, prevention, and healthcare and advocacy. What has been called a PrEP debate, I would say, has been a fairly misleading polemic. So on the one end, a very, very small minority of people, as far as I can tell, believe that it encourages sexual promiscuity, the implication being that that's a bad thing, and on the other, deafeningly loud sex-positive voices who argue that it's about choice and responsibility for oneself and one's sexual health. The sex-positive camp proudly proclaims themselves Truvada whores, or some similar name, and as heirs to the birth control movement and part of a legacy of sexual liberation and empowerment. I think the notion of this debate has been massively overblown for the minority of PrEP dissenters, and the Truvada whore blogosphere has in some ways become a campaign more about exhibitionist masculine gay sexuality, the confessional impulse, and 20 and 30-somethings finding a platform to verbally explore and divulge their sexuality about HIV and AIDS, or rather than being about HIV and AIDS. I don't think that there's any doubt that PrEP is effective when it's used properly. I think as a PAUSE person it is unquestionable that it's effective because it's the same drug that PAUSE people take to reduce their viral load and manage their HIV infection. PrEP works because HIV treatment works. I also think that no PAUSE person would deny that effective pharmaceuticals should be available to anyone who wants them or needs them, as should all healthcare. This, of course, is not the case, and that's super fucked up. This is likely unsurprising to most people, but Gilead, who produces Truvada, is the largest and most profitable pharmaceutical company in the world because of two interrelated epidemics, HIV and Hep C. And it owns the patents to Atripla, Complera, Emtreva, Stribald, Truvada for HIV treatment, PEP and PrEP, Tybost, Viread, and Solvaldi. They don't really make them that easy to pronounce, among others, which range in cost from $50 a day to $1,000 a day and must be taken every day. In 2013, Gilead posted corporate profits of $11.2 billion and has a total net worth of $155 billion, largely thanks to their death grip on the 35 million people on or seeking HIV treatment globally and the 130 to 150 million people living with Hep C globally who are seeking access to the only cure whose patent is held by Gilead. There was a time when this would be called AIDS profiteering by the activist community. Instead, what we see, and what is most prevalent in the media, on social media, and in AIDS service organizations, is the obsessive self-identification with Gilead as a brand. In my view, the PrEP campaign is the most skilled marketing campaign by a pharmaceutical company ever, as it sells HIV treatment to people as prevention for a disease for which they would be taking the treatment anyways. Instead of Truvada being used only by HIV-positive people to treat their infection, it has been rebranded as a preventative, opening up an entirely new market of people. The irony, as a PAUSE person on treatment, of watching HIV-negative men clamor for access to the treatment that I'm mandated by my free will for now, but at some point in the future, and in certain places already by the law, to take to prevent the disease, which is completely manageable and treatable by that same medicine, is intense. It's literally a chapter from Aldous Huxley's dystopian classic, Brave New World. Because Gilead is a major, if not majority funder of all AIDS publications, including PAUSE Magazine, The Body, and Positive Life, among others, AIDS service organizations, AIDS education projects, and prevention projects, as well as funding most conferences, summits, gatherings, blogs, outreach campaigns, NGOs, etc., 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 it is unsurprising that there is so little space for dissension. And with the support of proud Gilead consumers, they are swiftly called homophobic, sex-negative, or misinformed. The consumer's frenzy around PrEP has also manifested in a historically fascinating way for me. I study history, so I find sort of the way we tell our stories very interesting. The language of Truvada whores thoroughly appropriates the language of early sexual liberation, civil rights, and feminism, combined with the language of classic treatment activism. But in the new version, the liberation is personal and privatized, and the treatment is preventative rather than life-saving. Where once this type of movement demanded action, accountability, and results from institutions for communities, we now see individuals asserting their right to protection and safety, not only from other members of their community, but also others in their community, or above others in their community, pardon me. So what we are seeing is really the neoliberal revamping of AIDS activism, in which access, rights, safety, and risk are individualized and consumption-based. What does this do to the public face of the AIDS movement? Where once AIDS activism was focused on challenging big pharma, AIDS activism is now interchangeable with technological development. The most public face of AIDS activism is treatment activism. This began early and necessarily with ACT UP's Treatment and Data Group in the 1980s and is chronicled in How to Survive a Plague, where we see a progression from challenging scientific processes, testing, and neglect to sitting on boards of the NIH, CDC, and the FDA. The unethical use of placebo trials in AIDS drug testing was once the lightning rod issue for AIDS activism. And now people brand themselves with a company who uses placebos, tests its drugs using colonial networks in French West Africa, pays its poorest subjects using nail polish in exchange for testing positive for HIV, with zero commitment to long-term care, despite being the sole body that can provide it. There is a narrative that's quite popular which says that treatment activism produced the life-saving treatments that so many people rely on, but I would argue that it was in the best capitalist interests of these pharmaceutical companies to develop these treatments, as they create lifelong and necessary dependence, a huge cash cow. In fact, I might go further to say that treatment activism lubed up the money-making machine to expedite drug release and streamline human trials, facilitating drug production, which, while being for a very good reason, embedded this aspect of the AIDS movement within the capitalist structures being challenged in other corners of the movement. And if we fast forward to today, where AIDS activists are now a fundamental part of the marketing campaign for PrEP, both pro bono and paid. And the relationship with the state runs along a parallel narrative. I won't go on and on, but I think it is nicely summarized by the recent moves by New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo. His plan, released in June to reduce new infections in New York, included a full endorsement of PrEP, and was officially announced at the New York City Pride to a huge cheering audience, and was praised by progressives, AIDS activists, and the LGBT community. Treatment Action Group, which was formerly the Treatment and Data Wing of ACT UP, were so overwhelmed with pleasure that they could barely contain themselves in a press release, stating, "New York State has always been a leader and a center of innovation in the fight against HIV." This is a patent lie. Mark Harrington should know better, seeing as how he occupied the state capitol and watched as Vito Russo gave this compelling speech condemning New York State for its massive neglect of people with AIDS in Albany. But nonetheless, this is a telling rewriting of the relationship between activism and the state. What is left out of this press release is that besides the massive subsidizing of Gilead drug distribution, Gilead also happens to be a major campaign contributor to Andrew Cuomo. The core of Andrew Cuomo's plan is a radical expansion of surveillance public health laws, including track and treat, directly observed treatment, and the incarceration for positive people who fail to comply with the state's understanding of their best interests, by which I clearly mean the best interests of the state and not the people. The growing relationship with capital and the relationship with the state over time, with particular intensity in the last 15 years, makes it unsurprising, I suppose, that we are in this moment of total co-optation of the AIDS movement by the interests which historically and continually make life a living hell for positive people. What does this leave us with? A single AIDS discourse in a language of biomedicine, supported by notions of safety, risk, and responsibility, all mediated through institutions of the state, such as the criminal justice system, and capital. So in this moment, I think it's essential to question what PrEP represents for our community. When I hear people talk about their freedom to take PrEP, or the liberation of their sexuality as a result of Truvada, I cannot help but think that they lack a fundamental understanding of what freedom should be. When PAWS people continue to struggle to access treatment, a recent article in the New York Times said as few as 30% of people in the United States living with HIV have access to medicine, and I've heard numbers as low as 18% in North America. And still, more than 1 million people die each year due to lack of access. It begs the question, as a community, do we only care about ourselves? As being queer, and I say queer because that's the community that I consider myself a part of, and from which the specific AIDS activism I'm talking about evolved out of, has it become a question of personal sexual liberation, or can we still salvage the community building and solidarity-based projects from which the language of Truvada horrors has been appropriated? What does it mean that sexual freedom is talked about in terms of risk prevention and safety by NAG people via privileged access, when PAWS people's sexual freedom is governed by the criminal justice system? There's a tendency for the political significance of science to be minimized and technologies to be understood as neutral. In this case, people keep saying it's just another tool in the toolbox. The problem with this is that there are so many goddamn tools in the toolbox, and people are still dying and going to prison. We are in a moment when there are so many technological fixes and so few people have access to them. Despite how it may sound, I actually do think that people should have access to PrEP, but I do not think it supersedes the need for massive improvements in treatment access for PAWS people or the need for a broad-based community response to HIV criminalization. I think PrEP is a legitimate personal choice and it should be there for people who want it, but I think that its political significance has been fundamentally overstated, and its proponents either knowingly or unknowingly are participating in the systems that make life harder for PAWS people everywhere. HIV decriminalization and treatment access are the only silver bullets to ending HIV. They are the key to prevention, destigmatization, and improved quality of life for PAWS and NAG people. And we need to refocus the huge amount of energy, visibility, and resources going into PrEP towards the true work of AIDS today, or the true AIDS work of today. Thank you.